Hello YouTube, I'm gonna try to show why I think that the transcendental arguments for the existence of God don't really work, why I think that we shouldn't approach them from why I think they're bad arguments. And I know that some people don't see the moral argument for God as being a transcendental type of argument. Some do, some don't. But what I'm going to talk about is the way that these types of arguments are formulated, that the way they are formatted, I guess you would call it. And for example, the moral argument for the existence of God says that if God does not exist, objective moral truths don't exist. Objective moral truths do exist, therefore God exists. And the way these arguments are formulated is that if A does not exist, then B doesn't exist. B does exist, therefore A exists. And for these types of arguments to work, the premises have to be true without a doubt. They have to be true in order for the conclusion to follow. If one is not true, then the conclusion does not follow. And I think that the problem I have is with the first premise, because the first premise needs to be shown to be true. And I think that the way to show that the first premise is true is by first showing that A exists, showing that B exists, and showing how A and B have a cause and effect relationship, specifically that A is the cause of B. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's say that I'm arguing how rainbows prove the existence of light. And my first premise is that if light does not exist, rainbows don't exist. Rainbows do exist, therefore light exists. Well, the first premise needs to be shown to be true. So without a doubt, right? We shouldn't have any doubt of the first or second premise of being true. So how do I show that the first premise is true? Well, the first thing I need to prove is that light exists. The second thing I need to prove is that rainbows exist. And the third thing I need to prove is that light and rainbows have a cause and effect relationship, specifically light being the cause of rainbows. So how do I prove that light exists? Well, I go outside and look at the sun and see that it's giving out light. How do I prove that rainbows exist? Well, I can go outside and after a rainy day and see a rainbow in the sky. And I've proven that rainbows exist that way. And how do I prove that light is the cause of rainbows? Well, I can go outside and take a glass prism, and put it on the sign, let the sunlight go in and breaking the sun's light into different colors of light, creating a rainbow. Or I could sprinkle water outside and seeing how the light reflecting through the water creates a rainbow. Or I could get a flashlight, I guess, and point it, or some type of light, and point it through the prism and see how it creates a rainbow. And I could say that light causes rainbows to exist, and then I could come and prove the first premise to be true, which is that if there's no light, then there's no rainbows. If light does not exist, then there's no rainbows, because how would you create a rainbow without light, right? According to the previous proofs that I have. And why do I have to prove that light exists, and why do I have to prove that rainbows exist? Well, I have to do this in order to show how the cause and effect relationship is true. Because if one of these is not true, let's say that A is not true, then there's no way of me proving that the cause and effect relationship is true either. For example, let's say that my premise was that if leprechauns don't exist, rainbows do not exist. Rainbows do exist, therefore leprechauns exist. Well, in order for me to prove the first premise, I need to prove that leprechauns exist, I need to prove that rainbows exist, and I need to prove the relationship between leprechauns and rainbows, the cause and effect relationship between them both, specifically leprechauns being the cause of rainbows. Well, what if I don't prove that leprechauns exist? What does this make to the argument? Well, I could say that leprechauns, I could say, well, I'm not, let's say that leprechauns exist. Let's say that A exists. Let's say that A exists and B exists. Then I have to show how A and B have a cause and effect relationship. And I would say, well, leprechauns create pots of gold, and these pots of gold create rainbows. And therefore, if leprechauns don't exist, then pots of gold, then rainbows don't exist. Well, we know this is not true. However, this is what assuming that leprechauns exist can do to our conclusion. That's why we can't assume that A or B to be true, because if we are not sure if A or B is true, then there's no way of showing the cause and effect relationship to be true. How do we show that leprechauns are the cause of rainbows if we're not even sure if leprechauns do in fact exist? And how can we affirm for it to be true that leprechauns are, that if leprechauns don't exist, rainbows don't exist? There's no way of doing this. And I think it's the same way with God. And some people might say that if God does not exist, the universe doesn't exist. The universe exists, therefore God exists. And in order for them to prove the first premise, they could say, well, let's just say that if God existed, right? Let's just say if God existed, and we know that the universe exists. Well, they could then say God created the universe on will or whatever, or they could say God created the devil who created the universe, but we need to be sure that we know that God created the devil, and we need to be sure that the devil created the universe, and we for a fact need to be sure that God exists, or else the whole argument falls down. And then we could say that if God doesn't exist, the universe does not exist, and then we can keep on going with the rest of the argument, which says that if the universe exists, therefore God exists. We have to prove that the things we're talking about exist before making the first premise. I've heard people that say that logic proves God, and they say that logic is founded in God. And the way they do this is by saying that if God does not exist, logic does not exist. Logic does exist, therefore God exists. Well, the first thing they need to prove is that God exists. Then they need to prove that logic exists. Then they need to show how God is the cause of logic. If we haven't proven that God exists first, then how can we show that He's the cause of anything if we don't even know if He exists? And then we've proven after we do this, we've proven the first premise, and then we could say, well, logic exists, therefore God exists. And that's the reason why I think all these transcendental arguments don't work. Because in order for the first premise to be true, well, we have to prove God exists, or else we can't prove that the first premise is definitely true. How would we? We could say, well, maybe if God existed, He could be the explanation for logic, and we could also say, well, maybe if, let's say that we didn't know what the real cause of rainbows was, we didn't know that light was the causes of rainbow, we could say, well, even if nobody know, we could say, well, maybe, let's say that leprechauns exist. Well, if they exist, they could explain how rainbows are formed, and we could give our cause and effect relationship of leprechauns making pots of gold, which in turn makes rainbows. But these are just if arguments, like if, maybe statements. If leprechauns existed, if God existed. But if we don't prove they exist, then the first premise of the arguments don't hold, and we can't, and the whole argument falls down. We can't, because we are not even sure if the first premise is true. We can say, if, for example, the moral argument, if God does not exist, objective moral argument, objective moral truths don't exist, objective moral truth exists, therefore God exists. We first need to prove God exists in this situation to know that He is the source of morality. We need to prove that God exists in order for us to know that He's the source of the universe. We need to know that God exists before to prove that He's the source of logic, and then we could assert that logic exists, the universe exists, and morality exists. Therefore, God exists. If we can't do this, then there's no way of coming up with this conclusion. It just becomes like saying, well, maybe if He existed, He could be a possible explanation. But as long as we don't know if He exists, then we don't know the true explanation for the things that we are talking about. We don't know the source of these things. We just think that God might be a good explanation, but this does not prove that God exists in any way or that He is the cause of them. And just to finish, let's say that we do find that God exists, and we do know that that rainbows exist, or the earth exists, or whatever other thing exists. If there's no cause and effect relationship between them both, then just knowing that God exists and postulating that something else exists doesn't prove that God exists. For example, let's say that we know that God exists. Let's say that we know rainbows exist, but God is not the cause of rainbows. Let's just say that God is not the cause. God is not the cause of rainbow. Well, the first premise doesn't matter. The first premise of the arguments don't matter. If God exists, if God does not exist, then rainbows don't exist, because God is not the cause of rainbows, so it doesn't follow. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. That's the reason why I think transcendental arguments don't work, because in order for just the first premise to be true, you first need to prove God, which is what the whole argument is trying to do. And it's just not possible to do it that way. It's just circular reasoning. So I hope this have been informative, and thank you for watching.